Okay, thanks. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice here at SEPA. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and it's a special privilege to moderate this conversation with my colleague Steve Sestanovich and my old boss, Stuart Eizenstat. I frequently have students ask me for career advice here at Columbia, and what I tell them is persistence, smarts will get you a long way. If you're lucky, you'll get the perfect job where you get to staff a senior person in government, spend time with them, learn from them, and if you're especially lucky, you'll do that for someone who is brilliant, who's a good person, who has a career dedicated to public service, and who through their work ethic and moral compass is a role model for the kind of career you might hope to emulate. And that was the good fortune I had when Stu hired me at the Treasury Department 20 years ago. It was demanding, it was deeply rewarding. His stamina and his work ethic are legendary, part of what makes him such a successful negotiator. Whenever an impossible foreign policy issue came up, from the Kyoto climate talks to sanctions with Cuba and Iran, or the Japan port agreement, or his work on especially Holocaust restitution, he'd give the problem to Stu, and he would get it done. He's now a partner at Covington and Burling. I won't recite his very long and distinguished resume, but it includes stints as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Undersecretary of State, Undersecretary of Commerce, Ambassador to the EU, and for the purposes of our talk today, the Domestic Policy Advisor to President Carter. The book he has just written, which I've read twice, and it is long, but it is really a wonderful read, is President Carter, The White House Years. I recommend it to everyone. We're selling it in the back. Many of our students have it already because we bought a bunch of copies and gave it out in advance of this. I think it's fair to say that public trust in government might be at a low point, but if you want your faith in public service restored, spend a little time with Stu. He's a national treasure, really, and it was an honor to work for him. It's an honor to have him spend time with us today talking about the legacy of President Carter. He's going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation with me and Steve and take some questions from all of you. Please join me in welcoming to Columbia University, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat.
Thank you very much, Jason. It's really wonderful to be here with you and Steve. And I'm going to truncate my normal talk so that we can have more time for Q&A, but let me try to set the scene. Jimmy Carter's political idol was Harry Truman, and he put his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," on his Oval Office desk. Both presidents left the White House highly unpopular. Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements than his failures, and I'm hopeful that my book will have a similar impact on a reassessment of Jimmy Carter as president, not just as an admired former president. Almost 70% of all of our major legislation was passed, just under the percent of the first president I served in the White House for, Lyndon Johnson. He honored the office. He respected the independence of the judiciary, of the Justice Department, of the FBI, and of the role of the press in a free society, even when it was brutal in its assessment of them. Walter Mondale, as vice president, put it very succinctly in words that are emblazoned on the Carter Center: "We told the truth, we obeyed the law, and we kept the peace." Now, the rap on the Carter presidency is summarized, excuse my southern accent, by 4 I's: inflation, Iran, inexperience by himself and his Georgia Mafia, and inter-party warfare with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And all of these are very real, and the reason the book has gotten great reviews from the New York Times and Washington Post and others is because it's honest and candid. I don't whitewash these problems, but they obscure a tremendous set of accomplishments at home and abroad of lasting impact. And so before all the eyewitnesses were gone and history's verdict was somehow indelibly sealed that Jimmy Carter was a failed president, I wanted to write a complete assessment of the president, mistakes and all, including my own. This is not a book that could have been titled "If He'd Only Listened to Me," but also to look at the major accomplishments. In order to appreciate the book, it is based on 5,000 pages of contemporaneous notes and 350 interviews, and you have to understand the era of the 1970s in which we governed to appreciate the presidency. It was a period of rather epic change. We had gone through the trauma of losing our first war abroad in Vietnam. We had urban violence racking our cities. I remember being on the portico of the White House complex under the Johnson administration seeing 16th Street burn. It was an era in which a new term of art had to be invented for the simultaneous low growth and high inflation, called stagflation, that consumed all three presidents of that decade. It was a decade in which a whole range of social and political movements began, which are very much with us today: the environmental movement, the consumer movement, the Black Power movement, now morphed into Black Lives Matter, the women's rights movement, now hashtag Me Too, and after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, the Right to Life movement began as well. A political force which is absolutely central to our politics today began during this period with Reverend Jerry Falwell catalyzing the evangelical movement into a political force, and Ronald Reagan very skillfully in defeating us in 1980 combined that newly energized evangelical movement, heavily based in the South, with Richard Nixon's so-called silent majority of disaffected blue-collar workers, and that's precisely the political base of Donald Trump today. The 70s was also very important abroad. We were in the midst of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was at the apex of its influence and power, huge increases in defense spending, supporting Cuban proxy troops to foment communist revolutions in the Horn of Africa, as we'll discuss shortly, invading Afghanistan, supporting Euro-communist parties in Western Europe, with particular success in Italy, where a former colleague and my great friend Dick Gardner was ambassador. It was a decade abroad in which a new political force emerged, the People's Republic of China, more on that again in a moment. It was a period in which a Polish-born priest became Pope John Paul II, and along with Carter's own human rights campaign, began to give hope to those living behind the Iron Curtain. And it was a decade in which a revolution which is with us to this very day, and which totally engulfed and in some respects ended our administration, the Iranian radical revolution burst onto the scene. I'm going to very quickly summarize the accomplishments and not give you a lot of the color that I normally give in a longer speech, because I hope that Steve and Jason can bring that out. The first thing is energy. The energy security we enjoy today, the lack of dependence on OPEC oil, the fact that we're the #1 energy producer in the world, rests heavily on the foundation of 3 major energy bills that Carter passed, which ended price controls on natural gas and crude oil to allow more production, put conservation at the center of our energy policy with the first fuel economy standards, inaugurated the new clean energy era with solar and wind. I was with him, and I have a photo in the book of him installing a solar panel on the roof of the White House. And it was a tremendous accomplishment to break the back of the hardest of these, which was the natural gas impasse that had lasted since 1948, accomplished in the map room of the White House, named for FDR charting the course of World War II there, and it was like we were in our own domestic war. And with something you wouldn't see today, getting 2 conservative Republican senators and 2 liberal House members to agree on a formula to end price controls on natural gas. He was a great consumer champion, appointed consumer advocates, some from Ralph Nader's Raiders, to regulate industry, not as today, having people who worked for or lobbied for industries regulating their own industries, and then married it to transformative deregulation of all modes of transportation, trucks, rail, buses, and in particular for you and I airlines. These regulations prevented new carriers from coming in, prevented price competition. We democratized air travel and brought it to the middle class. That might not seem so great when you're sitting in row 36E in the middle and you're squeezed, but in fact we really did bring air travel to the middle class. And the reason you have the JetBlues and the Southwests is because of airline deregulation. We did the same with telecommunications, started the cable era, and even ended prohibition era regulation on local craft beers. He was the greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt. We doubled the size of the national park system over the fierce opposition of the Alaska delegation. And as a southern deep south governor, which is where he came from, here's someone from the deepest part of the deep south who appointed more African Americans, more Hispanics, more Jews, and more women to judgeships and federal senior positions than all 38 presidents before him put together. We supported affirmative action in universities, had minority set-asides, saved this city from bankruptcy, as we did with Chrysler, created a Department of Education, and much, much more. Created the new, in effect, modern vice presidency out of whole cloth, the constitutional afterthought. He and Mondale, during the transition, decided that this was going to be a real position, access to all classified documents, to all meetings. I mean, Truman didn't even know that there was an atomic bomb project under FDR, one-on-one meetings in the Oval Office, and even brought, which Mondale didn't ask for, brought the office of the vice president into the West Wing, symbolizing that he was a real partner. All the ethics legislation that was passed and that it's law today in an ethically challenged Washington, every single piece we enacted. The ethics law of '78, regulating and requiring the disclosure of your assets coming in, limiting gifts when you're in, limiting lobbying when you're out. Where did Robert Mueller come from? From our Office of Special Counsel to investigate potential wrongdoing by high officials, inspectors general in every department, reforming the civil service, reforming CIA, and much, much more. One anecdote, and I don't want to take any more time on this, but it's a cute anecdote. I got caught up in the gift limit. There was a $25 gift limit. There was a magazine article saying I had a great penchant for Tootsie Rolls. The one sent Tootsie Rolls. I got a giant box of Tootsie Rolls, and I thought I was going to be father for life to my young kids, bringing home only to find out from the ethics officer, he said, I'm damned if I'm going to count every one of these, but I think it's worth more than $25. I had to return it with a letter saying we're living in a post-Watergate higher ethics period. And then a year later, there's a profile of the Tootsie Roll Company, and the CEO says, Eizenstat tried to have it both ways. He writes us this high and mighty letter about new ethics. We open the box, it's empty. So I'm still trying to find the Secret Service agent who stole my Tootsie Rolls. Our Achilles heel domestically was one of the four I's, inflation. We inherited high inflation, and it got worse in our administration. And Carter called us in mid-1979 as we were looking to a re-election campaign, and he said, I've tried everything to deal with this embedded inflation. 2 anti-inflation czars, 5 anti-inflation speeches, voluntary wage and price guidelines, cutting domestic spending to satisfy financial markets and alienating the liberal wing in the process. Nothing's worked. I'm prepared to take, over the objection of many of us, the toughest medicine that the economy can take. I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Fed, knowing in advance, as I described in a celebrated meeting in the Oval Office between the two of them, exactly what Volcker was going to do, because he told the president, don't appoint me if you're not prepared for the stiff medicine I'm going to give. I'm going to tighten the money supply. It's going to cause interest rates and unemployment to rise in your re-election campaign. If you're not going to support me, don't appoint me. Don't say in the middle of the election, Volcker did it. Carter said, leave the politics to me. And it worked. He never criticized him in an election year. It worked. Inflation dropped like a rock after Reagan's first year, not in time to help us for re-election. And it's symbolic of so much of what we did that only flowered afterward. Foreign policy. I dare say, and Steve will talk more about, because there's so much interest in the whole Middle East peace process, and there's so many interesting anecdotes, but to say in one sentence, Camp David and the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, which followed 6 months later, are the greatest act of personal presidential diplomacy in American history, more than Wilson after World War I by far. 13 agonizing days and nights, 22 draft agreements. He had to negotiate separately with Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat, because we put them together the first day, and it was like two scorpions in a bottle. I'll tell you, hopefully, some anecdotes when we get to the question period. Second, on foreign policy, is human rights. He believed that our foreign policy should reflect the best of our domestic views. It was not a dewy-eyed notion. We were in competition during the Cold War for the hearts and minds of people around the world. And in his human rights policy, he applied it to the military dictators in Latin America, created a new era in Latin relations with the Panama Canal Treaty, something you wouldn't see again today. The Republican minority leader, Howard Baker, supports the Panama Canal Treaty, knowing that it would mean he'd never get the Republican nomination. And Senator Hayakawa, an unlikely support for the 2/3 we needed for the treaty in a bloody battle. He had coined the phrase, "It's our canal, we stole it fair and square." Hardly a likely vote for it. Mondale puts him on the phone with Carter. Carter says, "Senator, what can I do to get you to support the treaty?" "You know where I stand on the treaty. I'm totally against it. But if you let me see you once every 2 weeks in the Oval Office, just the two of us, to share my wisdom of where the country should be going, I'll then consider it." Carter says, "Only once every 2 weeks? I wouldn't want to limit you to that." Flattered he voted for the treaty. Carter never saw him again. We also applied hard, soft power to the Soviet Union, championed the democratic movement there of Sakharov, championed the Soviet Jewish movement, got the number of Soviet Jews out doubled during that time. It was this soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, saved Sharansky, the head of the movement's life. He said so in his own memoir by saying he wasn't a spy during his trial. And we applied, and I think, Steve, this is maybe the biggest surprise on the foreign policy side of my book. Carter is seen as weak on defense. I assert just the opposite, and it's validated by a new Pentagon study. We applied hard power as well to the Soviet Union. We increased defense spending substantially, got NATO to pledge the same. All the weapon systems which Reagan deployed, and I'd give him full credit for it, every single one we green-lighted, every single one. After Afghanistan's invasion by the Soviets, even conservatives say it was Carter's finest hour, the Carter Doctrine, arming the Mujahideen, draft registration, embargoing grain from the Soviet Union 4 weeks before the Iowa primaries, where they have caucuses where they make a lot of it, and boycotting the Olympics in 1980 and talking about a tough meeting, having all these Olympians in the White House who had trained for 4 years and telling them that they couldn't go and give the prestige to Moscow of the Moscow Games. China. Nixon and Kissinger deserve full credit for reaching out to China. They didn't normalize relations because of the power of the Taiwan lobby. We did. We severed relations with Taiwan. Under the Taiwan Relations Act, which was another bloody battle, we created the relationship that exists today, cultural and defense. Deng Xiaoping comes to the White House, 4'11", controlling 1 billion Chinese. We're in the cabinet room. He says to the president, "I appreciate you letting me be the first Chinese leader to come since World War II, but what I really want," it's deja vu all over again, "is the lowest tariff levels on my products." And he said, "I know that there is a bar to that because of the Jackson-Vanik law, but that is aimed at the Soviet Union, not giving low tariffs to countries which bar people from immigrating. We don't limit the number of Chinese who can leave." And so he takes a little White House notepad and a pencil, pushes it over to Carter and says, "Write on here the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year. 1 million? 10 million? So Carter laughs and says, "I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right here. I'll take 10 million Chinese if you'll take 10,000 American journalists." Neither had to fulfill that. Again, we'll talk about that more in the question period. Our coup de grace was Iran, without question. It's another one of those eyes. I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the exile of the Shah and for the Iranian Revolution any more than it would be fair to blame Eisenhower for the Cuban Revolution in 1959, 90 miles from our shore, or Obama for Mubarak being deposed. There's certain things that superpowers can't control. But having said that, I make the case here and to you and in the book, it's the worst intelligence failure in American history. The CIA, which had reinstalled him as a young Shaw, and then he had an open shopping list for every president since, didn't know that his domestic support rested on quicksand, didn't realize that for 5 years our principal ally was getting secret treatments for cancer, didn't appreciate the impact of Ayatollah Khomeini's incendiary tapes from exile outside of Paris, going back there. Horrific. What do you do when the hostages are taken? This is one case I wish he had taken my advice. I recommended and pointed out John Kennedy's blockade of Cuba as an example. Blockade the harbors of Carg Island where most of their oil comes out. Instead, Carter meets with the hostage families, says his number one priority is to get them out safe and sound, which he does, but only after 444 humiliating days of effort, incredibly debilitating. Every time we had a deal, Khomeini vetoed it. He holds himself up in the White House, another mistake, to show he's working full-time on it, cancels campaigning, cancels foreign trips. It only made him the hostage. And then, at the end, the press caused more attention to it. Walter Cronkite ends every broadcast on CBS, day 103, day 205, day 307 of the hostage crisis. The failed rescue effort was a metaphor somehow in people's minds for Carter and the presidency. When Desert One failed, people say it was for too few helicopters. Not so. The Joint Chiefs wanted 6. Carter added 2 more, maximum 8 to fit under the aircraft carrier and to avoid Soviet reconnaissance before. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, dust storms and so forth, but the basic problem was the lack of any joint command. We created it afterward. There was no coordination. Believe it or not, the entire operation was never practiced together before it started. And so when a helicopter rotor blade hit the C-130 cargo plane full of fuel to get the helicopters into Tehran and burst into flames, it killed 8 servicemen and engulfed our administration at the same time. Now, I'll close just with this, and then we'll take the question period. The book is full of anecdotes about real people who could come out of a Shakespearean play. I don't have time to go into those, but I'll talk just for a second about Carter himself. Here's someone who comes from a gnat-infested hamlet of 500 people into the Oval Office. By indefatigable campaigning, 100 days in Iowa before the caucuses alone, but also because, and every president who wins, and I've been involved in winning and losing campaigns, wins or loses if they know the message they want to give and it comports with where the people are. The message he had was removing the stain of Watergate. A government as good as its people. I'll never lie to you. And that resonated across party lines. Carter was a very odd politician. He had a very unusual view of politics. He was a ferocious campaigner, but he believed that once you got into the Oval Office, you parked politics at the Oval Office door and did the right thing. That enabled him to take on tough issues like energy, like Panama, like the Middle East peace process, which were political losers. But it also was a weakness because he forgot that a president is not just commander-in-chief, he has to be politician-in-chief. He has to nurture his base, keep his party together, which this president does every minute of every day. We had a tremendous split in the party when Ted Kennedy ran. We can talk about that over national health insurance. And ironically, our national health insurance bill, which Kennedy rejected, is exactly Obamacare. Employer-mandated coverage, Medicaid expansion, covering kids and catastrophic illness. We lost 20 years by not having an agreement, and the split really weakened us going into the general election. So let me just close with this. This book will not only help you understand the Carter presidency, it will help you understand the presidency, the hothouse atmosphere, the competing pressures and interest groups, the fact that the options often are bad or worse, and you'll understand what it takes to be a president and what leadership is all about. So in the book, I don't nominate Carter for a place on Mount Rushmore, but I do suggest that he belongs in the foothills with a number of other presidents who have made lasting contributions at home and abroad to making this a better country and a better world. Thanks, and I'll be glad now to take the questions from Steve and Jason, and appreciate you coming.
There are many things from Stu. One is to always use yellow legal pens. I'm pretty sure this book is a summary of perhaps 5,000?
5,000 pages, yes.
I'm guessing 5,000 yellow legal pads, or pages?
Pages.
Let me turn this on. And so we're going to come back in a little bit to talk about what we spend our time on at the Center on Global Energy Policy, energy and environment issues. I'm sure people will want even more. And so in the next week or two, one of our Monday released episodes of Columbia Energy Exchange podcast will be a 45-minute conversation Stu and I just did, just going deep into energy and environment issues specifically. So since we have that coming out, we'll come back to those issues, and I'll turn it to Steve Sestanovich now to start with a broader set of some of the economic and foreign policy issues.
Great. I think Stu has certainly convinced you that the Carter record is extremely consequential, with many important achievements and many issues in which, even if the achievements weren't fully realized, there was a kind of pivot point in American policymaking. Lots of problems that were not seen in the same way afterwards as before. And I would say, if I could start with this, Stu, that the leading case of that in foreign policy is human rights, which every American president since has, every is maybe strong, but because there is an incumbent in the White House today who has a slightly different view, but every American president since then has been obliged to treat human rights as an important interest of the United States in its relations with other states. There have been many books about this. In my course, we read one of them. I think that issue will be forever associated with Carter's name. But I want to put a problem to you in talking about it, which you discuss even in your book, which is that people in the administration were not of one mind about what it meant, and there's a kind of inevitable dilemma in the use of human rights. You quote Harold Brown as saying it made Jimmy Carter look like a wimp. He was a do-gooder, and that actually, in Brown's view, undermined foreign policy. But the flip side of that is human rights are really an aggressive weapon used against other countries in a way that American presidents don't often appreciate. So I wonder whether you can say a little bit about how Carter saw that balance, how other people in the administration did, and how you think they handled the dilemma.
So it's a very important question. Carter saw human rights abroad as the flip side of civil rights at home. And just as he championed civil rights at home, he wanted our foreign policy to reflect our best values abroad. He built on the 1975 Helsinki Agreement, the so-called third basket, but it was a sharp break from the Nixon-Kissinger policy of realpolitik. The Nixon-Kissinger policy, and I'm not suggesting this is all wrong, was you don't look at what's happened internally in a country. You don't care about what's happening internally. It's their external conduct that's critical. And therefore, you support military dictators in Latin America, even though they're repressive, even though they're imprisoning pro-democracy people, because they're pro-American and they're anti-communist. You support the Shah, even though he's repressive, because he's our guy. I mean, it's a realpolitik situation. And I'll give you one anecdote I quote in a book, and I say this as a very good friend of Kissinger's. but a transcript came out a couple of years ago. So Golda Meir comes to the White House, the Prime Minister of Israel. She finishes her trip, and Nixon and Kissinger are talking. And Golda had made a plea for Nixon and Kissinger to champion the rights of Soviet Jewry to emigrate. And Nixon says to Kissinger, you know, this is not our issue. What the Soviets do to Soviet Jews is not our issue. What we care about is their external conduct. And Kissinger, who was a refugee himself, says, yes, even if they put them in concentration camps, we don't care. Now, I mean, I think he was playing to Nixon's. But that's basically the view of real politics.
Gas ovens, I believe, is
Yes.
what he said.
Yes. And so Carter was a sharp break from that, but human rights also can't be the only organizing principle of foreign policy. We did give, contrary to critics who say we undermine the Shah by promoting human rights in Iran, we did not. We gave him a pass. We gave Marcos in Philippines a pass. We applied it where we could in Latin America and the Soviet Union. And I want to take your point, Steve, that it was not a sign of weakness applied to the Soviet Union, particularly when we married hard power to it. It was a sign of strength. Why? Because it began to unravel the Soviet Union. It gave hope to those living behind the Iron Curtain. It stirred up the pro-democracy movement. And in the end, that was at least one of the factors that led to the unraveling of the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union. So we used it as an offensive weapon. Now, one of the problems in our foreign policy, and I'm absolutely explicit about it, is it was hydra-headed. We have the transition after the '76 election. We get the first CIA briefing. I was the only aide. And by the way, the CIA briefing chief was George H.W. Bush, who was the CIA director. And in a break, Carter calls me to the side of the House, planes, and said, I'm thinking of having Zbig Brzezinski be our national security advisor and Cyrus Vance our Secretary of State. Now, I had worked with both of them because I coordinated all policy in the campaign. And I said to the president-elect, either one would be great, but together it'll be terrible. And he said, why? And I said, because they have absolutely opposite views on the major issue you'll be facing, the Soviet Union. Size of a dove and as big as a hawk. And he said, I like differences of opinion, I can handle it. Well, he didn't handle it well. Zbig wanted him to take a much tougher stand on the Cuban proxies that were being used. He wanted to stall on, and back off on SALT, the nuclear agreement. He wanted to be much more aggressive, and Tsai wanted to manage it. And Carter tried to marry these two, and in a famous speech at his alma mater, the Naval Academy, he basically stitched together Tsai's statement that, you know, we want cooperation, and Zbig's that we want to be tough. And so that dissonance caused a problem. It was only resolved after the Afghan invasion, when Carter clearly moved into Zbig's hardline policy. I believe to this day the real reason that Cy Vance left as Secretary of State was not his opposition to the hostage rescue effort. It was being worn down by battling Zbig and finally seeing Carter move into Zbig's camp after Afghanistan.
Jason?
So I'm going to switch to energy for a moment, not surprisingly. And I just want you to set the scene. You know, I run something that has the words energy policy in it, Center on Global Energy Policy. The 1970s is when the idea of there was a thing called energy policy was first emerging. Prior to the 1970s, it really didn't exist. You didn't talk much about energy. There wasn't real much thought to the role of government aside from times of war. So just set the scene for what you inherited coming in, this Byzantine system of price controls, what impacts they had, and then the efforts to pursue oil and gas price deregulation, conservation and efficiency, and especially the natural gas price deregulation, because I think that was harder than people realize and more consequential than people realize.
Barack Obama was asked, what does he remember about the Carter energy policy? And he said, the gas lines. That's what you remember. That's why I wrote this damn book, okay? because we totally transformed energy policy. What did we inherit? Nixon was the subject of the first real shock after the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC oil embargo, gasoline lines, high inflation, exactly what we had after Iran. Carter comes into office where it was not a campaign issue against Ford. He makes a mistake, I think, of saying in the transition, we're going to have a comprehensive energy bill within 90 days, no time for economic analysis, no time for consultation. But having said that, and I'm totally candid about all the political mistakes we made, here's what we did at the end of 4 years in 3 bills. We ended the price controls on natural gas and crude oil. The natural gas price controls went back to 1948. They prevented production because you were not giving price signals. If you produced natural gas in Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, you could charge world prices, market prices in those states. As soon as you took it by pipeline to New York, it was regulated at prices far below world prices, so nobody wanted to send gas out. Crude oil was strictly controlled by Nixon as part of the wage and price controls and not ended. So,
which led to the lines we saw.
yes,
during
which led to the
things like
lines.
Arab
And
oil
so,
embargo,
so
these
by
price
releasing those controls, we did 2 major things. Number one, we encouraged domestic production. It's one of the reasons why this country this year produces more oil and gas than Saudi Arabia or Russia. We're the #1 producer in the world. But it also had a second effect, which was a second part of our energy policy, conservation. If you can buy a vegetable, a head of lettuce for a nickel, you're going to buy all the lettuce you can possibly get. Well, it's the same with energy. When prices are artificially controlled, who the hell cares about how much you're going to use? Turn your thermometer up to 85 and drive the biggest car you can because you're not paying a real price for it. So it sent a price signal as well when we ended it.
Which is why there was so much controversy and hostility to it,
Yes.
because it meant higher
Exactly.
consumer prices.
And we are a unique country. We are, at the same time, a major producer and the biggest consumer. We're regionally divided between consuming and producing states. So the politics, which I lay out in these chapters, are horrific. Conservation was critical. We put in the first fuel economy standards for trucks and cars. And we inaugurated, as I mentioned, the clean energy era. We brought in competition for electric utilities, had required them to take on their lines at avoided cost the new small companies that were producing alternative energy. We pointed the way toward shale production. All of this was done, and nobody knows it because it didn't come to fruition until years later. People didn't see the results. And that's the same thing, as I mentioned, with Volcker and inflation. It worked, but the flowers of those seeds didn't come to bloom until after we left office.
But people remember him sitting by a fireplace in a cardigan sweater asking for sacrifice.
Asking for sacrifice and turn your thermostats down to 65 degrees, which, by the way, happened in the White House as well, until Rosalind and Miss Lillian, who was living there, said, I can't live with this, turn them back up. But it was a concept also, a president as a leader has to be sometimes buoyant. There was a Jeremiah quality to Carter. Tighten your belt, put your thermostats down. When we passed legislation, like major education legislation, he would, in his signing ceremony, say what Congress didn't pass rather than celebrating what it did. I mean, when Trump reaches an agreement in a couple of weeks with China, whatever's in it, it's going to be the greatest trade deal ever, right? And Carter wasn't good at that. He found compromise difficult. But he had a vision, and he had a determination to reach it, and he plowed through political opposition regardless, at huge political cost, but at great gain.
Stu, I want to pick up on Carter's personal qualities by asking you a question about Middle East policy. Yesterday was the 40th anniversary of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. And you tell a great story in the book about how that came about. Carter, there was an impasse between the Egyptians and the Israelis, no agreement, Sadat and Begin not moving, and Carter decided he's going to take a trip to the Middle East to try to seal the deal. And the response of all of his advisors is, don't do it. The Secretary of State said, don't do it. The National Security Advisor said, don't do it.
Stu Eizenstat said, don't do it.
Stu Eizenstat said, don't do it. The Vice President said, don't do it. And Carter went anyway and sealed the deal. So now, there's a kind of pig-headedness in this that reminds me of another president. And I wonder whether you can say what your sense of that is. Is it just orneriness, what you describe? Is it some intuition that there was going to work? A readiness to embarrass himself politically even if it didn't work? I mean, this was a weird, most presidents just would not do that under the circumstances.
Yeah, so let me set the stage really quickly. Carter believed in bringing peace to the Holy Land as a Baptist. We were engaged in a fight for the Soviet Union for influence in the region. Sadat had thrown out Soviet advisors in 1973. And then Sadat makes a historic trip to Jerusalem and surprises everybody after Carter tried to get the Geneva Conference together and it fails. He arrives after the Sabbath, Shabbat, in a gleaming white Boeing plane, Arab Republic of Egypt. They have to put a red carpet down quickly. The Israeli band didn't know how to play the Egyptian anthem. They had to listen to a recording. Generals who had fought are crying on the tarmac to see this happen. He pledges no more wars to the Knesset, and then months go by, they try to negotiate, nothing happens. So, Steve, you have to back up to Camp David,
sure,
where also we opposed. He decides to go for broke and see if he can break this impasse by inviting them to the presidential retreat. 13 agonizing days and nights, 22 drafts, and 2 personal anecdotes. He takes them in a presidential limousine the first Sunday of the 13 days, Begin on his left, Sadat on his right, to the Gettysburg battlefield. Why? To drive home what 5 wars meant, and that was enough. Sadat's a general. He had studied in the U.S. He knew all the problems of the Southern strategy, the Pickett's last charge. A little uncomfortable for Carter as a Southern president. Begin doesn't know the first thing about military, but he's a Lincoln scholar and delivers on the spot, verbatim, the Gettysburg Address. The last Sunday, everybody agreed, if we don't do it now, we're out of here. Begin says to Carter, I can't make and won't make any more compromises. Carter realizes, and this will get to your question, if this fails, Sadat could get assassinated. The whole Middle East region could go up in flames. It will reinforce the radicals like Assad, his current president's father. It'll engulf his own presidency in defeat. He knew that Begin loved his grandchildren, and so he gets 8 copies of a photograph of the 3 of them, pens in the names of each one, gives it to Begin in his cabin, and says, I want you to have this. Begin looks at each, vocalizes the names, starts crying himself, puts his bags down and says, I'll make one last try. That's the Camp David Accords. But it was an accord, not a binding treaty. In the accord, 3 months are the term for a treaty. 6 months go by, no treaty. And this is where your question comes in. So Carter had a choice, the risky choice or the choice of just letting it slide. And he felt he had gone so far, he had to make one last try. He couldn't let this fail. He couldn't let Sadat down. He couldn't let the Soviets come back in. He couldn't let his presidency fail. So he does shuttle diplomacy for 4 days, Again, we're close but not there. So Sunday again, Air Force One is fueled, airspace is cleared, all of his aides come from Jerusalem down to Tel Aviv. Begin calls up and says, I'd like to see you, Mr. President, before you go. We all assume it's just in effect to say thanks for coming, but no thanks. Carter, not expecting him, he and Rosalynn are dressing and say, please entertain the Prime Minister for a few minutes. Begin says, now, this hotel we're in, the King David Hotel, is a very historic hotel. Yes, we know, but not for the reasons you think. When I was head of the Irgun, the underground movement, I blew this up during the British Mandate, but I'm not going to do it while Carter's here, don't worry. So he goes up to the presidential suite. That's where the treaty is signed and sealed. They come down on the elevator. The historic Camp King David, the elevator breaks between floors. The Secret Service had to pull them both down. But first, I call it the breech birth of the treaty. But it was a sense that he had gone so far, he just couldn't let it go. And again, I mentioned this is a strength and a weakness. If it had failed, it would have been catastrophic. But it succeeded, and Steve, 40 years later, to the day yesterday, not one even technical violation, not one technical violation. And now Egypt and Israel, although it's not as warm a peace as it might, share intelligence on terrorists. And interestingly, when the terrorists started to come into the northern Sinai in the last year or two, Egypt went to Israel and asked if they could move some of their troops across the red lines set in the treaty closer to Israel's border to fight them, and Israel allowed it. But it's really quite amazing. It's the centerpiece of much of our Middle East policy to this day.
Should we take some questions?
Sure. Let me ask one more.
Oh,
Yeah.
go.
Because we talked about sort of the emergence of energy policy, creation of the Energy Department. There wasn't an Energy Department before. You also were in office just a few years after essentially the birth of the modern environmental movement, the Santa Barbara oil spill, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. And you in your book, again, I know you as not someone prone to hyperbole, call Carter the greatest presidential protector of our nation's natural bounty since Teddy Roosevelt, which is a strong statement.
Yes.
Talk about the environmental agenda.
So Carter, as governor, did something never before done by any governor, so far as I know, never done since. He blocked the Corps of Engineers dam project. I mean, this is bread and butter for governors and congressmen. They can put their name on the lakes because these dams were destroying free-flowing streams, diverting rivers, killing species of fish and so forth. So even then, it's called a Spruill Bluff Dam, he showed his great environmental love. He grew up in the rural areas of plains, fished and hunted and so forth. Comes into the White House, has a so-called hit list of water projects, again, politically maladroit in the extreme, gets everybody angry, but in the end shuts down these water projects, and then he doubles the size of the entire national park system that Teddy Roosevelt started with the Alaska Lands Bill. And again, as I mentioned, he does it over the fierce opposition of the Alaska delegation, and he did it again by an interesting use of presidential authority. The president has, every president has, since the early part of the 20th century, something called monuments authority. This president is demonumentizing things. The monuments authority allows you to preserve areas without going to Congress. And when you designate an area for a monuments designation, you can't do anything in that. You can't even fish in that area. And to bring the Alaska delegation to the negotiating table, which wanted the whole state open for oil and gas, he applies a mammoth monuments delegation. And that's what brought them to the negotiating table. So what we ended up with allowed some oil and gas exploration in non-sensitive areas. Now Trump wants the Arctic to be open and so forth. But that's how we did it, and he did it again with this map, negotiated. He knew every detail. And again, this was a strength and a weakness. He always wanted more information for our decision memos, the appendices. He would return memos of mine with spelling and punctuation errors. And I thought, this excessive attention to detail is a problem, but when I think about those who then govern by 3x5 cards afterward, or those who govern without 3x5 cards, maybe it's not such a bad trait after all.
Questions? Two over here. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. Thanks. Folks could just briefly introduce themselves and keep the questions brief. Is that?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Oh, there it is.
thanks.
Great. So Peter Clement, met you this morning. I'm a
Yes,
senior
thank you.
research scholar. My question is about the October surprise. I'm curious what your view is on the truth to that story.
Okay. So we have in our presence a Pulitzer Prize winning author, Kai Bird, who's also writing a book on Carter. And maybe Kai will find more information on this than I did. So there are two interesting things about the presidential election. We got blown out in the re-election. Okay? We win 6 states in the District of Columbia. We lose the popular vote by 10 million votes. No problem with hanging chads in Florida. We just got blown out. But 2 important anecdotes. Anecdote number 1. We made a serious mistake in debating Reagan 8 days before the election. Never do that with an opponent. Before the debate, we were slightly ahead in the polls. We had painted Reagan as a sort of cowboy with a fast trigger who said he wanted to end Medicare and Social Security and so forth. And Reagan is a great debater. He blew us away in the debate. Showed he was really a nice guy and so forth, and he really didn't mean everything he said. I show in my book, in an interview with Jim Baker, who confirms another book that was done. Jim Baker was his campaign manager. They stole the debate book that I had produced, okay, that had all the attack lines and so forth. Now, Baker said, it really didn't help us that much, but I sure would have liked to have had theirs. But the second goes to the October surprise. Khomeini had determined, it's clear now in retrospect, he was never going to allow Carter to get the hostages out before the election. We actually reached the agreement during the transition. He released the hostages 1 minute after Reagan is sworn in. That would have been transformative. So what was the October surprise? To condition the public, in case there was a last-minute agreement, the Reagan people kept saying, oh, Carter's going to pull a rabbit out of the hat, the October surprise. The real question is the opposite. Gary Sick, who was our national security advisor in Iran and a very sensible guy, and is actually with Columbia.
He's on our faculty. Yeah.
On the faculty, wrote a book asserting that the Reagan people went to Khomeini and said, don't release the hostages. You know how much you hate Carter. It'll be better under us. If you release the hostages, you'll win the election. Now, there was a congressional investigation of that. Maybe we should use Robert Mueller's terms, no conclusive evidence, but I don't necessarily controvert it, but it was not sufficient. What we do know is, and again, Kai, maybe you can get into this more, we do know that his campaign manager went to Mexico at the height of the campaign. There are not a lot of votes there. And we do know that his running mate, George H.W. Bush, went to Paris, where again, there are not a lot of votes. Was it part of this? Perhaps. I'm not asserting it was. I'm just saying those are facts. What is absolutely factual is not getting the hostages out was seminal. Because this, Steve, I think, and Jason, if there's anything that creates the impression of weakness, it's twofold. One, when you can't control inflation and it appears that it's out of control, even if it's not directly your fault. But the hostages, here is a third-rate country holding up the greatest country on earth for 444 days. Zbig believes, his national security advisor, and I do as well, if he had exercised military power, I don't mean bombing, but blockading, that it would have made a difference. Why didn't he do that? There were two reasons. Because, again, I want to stress, you'll see when you read the book, there are never any easy decisions for a president. There really aren't. So I wanted the blockade because I thought Khomeini at that time was fairly weak. He hadn't established himself. He wouldn't want to risk choking their entire economy by having no oil go out. The argument on the other side was, if you mine the harbors, which is one way of doing it, the Soviets will send minesweepers out, and even if you blockade, they may try to break the blockade. You'll have a superpower confrontation. The Soviets would have liked nothing better than to show they were champions of this new regime. And Ham Jordan said, it will get the hostages back in coffins. I don't believe that to this day. I think if he had harmed the first hostage, he knew it would have been World War III. And the evidence for that is the following. Carter did say to him, privately through the Swiss, if there are any show trials of our diplomats, if one of them has one hair on his head or her head harmed, I'll do military action. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen because Khomeini knew the consequences. So I really believe that in his fairly weakened state, he would have done it. It would have been transformative. One last thing on the hostage rescue. It was, of course, kept super secret. Again, I think it failed because of a lack of coordination. It was extremely complex. The helicopters had to get into Desert One, get to the suburbs, get trucks, then go into the middle of a major city to get the hostages out and go all the way back. Extremely risky and very complex. When it failed, that was the end of the administration in many ways.
We started a few minutes late, so we'll end just a few minutes late. There was one other question here, and then I think we'll leave time for people to buy books and hopefully get them signed, and then we have to get Stu off to a lunch.
You've answered this a bit about I want to bring us back to the 1980 election. You talked about how Senator Kennedy was a real problem in the election, in a primary fight that lasted a long time. I want to, if you could talk a little more about that. But I also wanted to ask you about John Anderson, who was a third-party candidate.
Anderson didn't make a difference. Anderson got about 7%.
One other question about the re-election, which is, as I remember, Carter didn't enter the first debate, which was between Reagan and Anderson. Was that in retrospect, was that a problem?
It was not a problem, but we got caught on our own petard because of it. We said we would only debate Reagan one-on-one because we thought if we were in a three-person debate, it would elevate Anderson's stature and take votes away from us. But then when Anderson was excluded because his percent went below the League of Women Voters, we were forced in a sense to. Now, here's the interesting thing about Kennedy. At the midterm convention in Memphis, 1978, with me on the platform and Joe Califano, our HEW secretary, he got a leaked copy of our budget in an early stage which had all sorts of cuts to satisfy. And he gives a speech called Blowing Against the Wind. It was really in many ways his opening gambit for a presidential run. Okay, then his number one goal, Ted, and may I say, I was at the Kennedy Library 2 nights ago. I'm the only Carter person Ted asked to have a transcript done. We had a very close relationship, even during this bitter primary. Okay, so Ted's number one goal from the day he got into the Senate to the day he died was national health insurance. And I negotiated, we had said in the 76 campaign we supported it. I negotiated in his Senate hideaway for weeks, and we reached an agreement in which he departed from the labor-backed single-payer Medicare for all system, sound familiar? And took our concept of a phased program over years, employer-based Medicaid expansion, he accepted it. And then labor put pressure on him and he backed away. And that became the predicate for his running. He said years later, by the way, where's the Carter bill when we really need it? But here's the terrible thing. Any president who faces a substantial opposition within his own party is going to be weakened. But Teddy never reconciled. He never reconciled. We had 50 minority planks to the platform. When I went on the floor of the convention in New York in 1980, the anger and bitterness were unbelievable. We had the Rules Committee. We had beaten Ted 2-1 in delegates, 2-1. The Rules Committee, Steve and Jason had, Teddy wanted to have an open convention. The delegates wouldn't be bound by the way people had voted in the primary. It sounds great, I mean, but it's undemocratic. The chairman of the Rules Committee for the Democratic Party is Dan Inouye, Japanese American, parents interned during World War II, fights in Italy, has his arm cut from battle. He had one arm. And he said to us after the Rules Committee, he hadn't seen such sweat and anger since Sicily. That's how bitter it was. So instead of having the sort of ritual handshake afterward, Ted had to be pushed onto the platform. I've got a picture in the book. It's the longest long-distance handshake you can have. He never campaigned for him. Okay, so here's the great anecdote. We lose the election. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but damned if it wasn't one of them. Okay, so after the election, December 1980, Teddy calls me up, and he said, there's a vacancy on the First Circuit Court of Appeals. I want the president to appoint Stephen Breyer, ever heard of him, to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And he said, you know, Steve came from Harvard Law School. He did airline deregulation with you guys. I said, look, Steve's fantastic, but there are two insurmountable hurdles, Ted. He said, what are those? I said, the first is there's no love lost between Carter and you because you ran against him and you never reconciled. He said, I know, that's why I'm asking you and not him. So he says, what's the second? I said, the second is, remember Merrick Garland? The second is we lost the Senate. Strom Thurmond's going to be the new chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Why didn't you just wait 2 months? Reagan will be sworn in. You'll have a conservative appointed. Why would Strom agree not to block Steve's appointment? You take care of Carter, I'll take care of Strom. So I go in to see Carter. I got one of my legal pads, and I said, don't ask me who asked for this, but there's a vacancy on the First Circuit. You know Steve Breyer. He knew what was up. He said, okay. I said, it'll be a tribute to you. Then I called Teddy. I said, okay, I've done my job. How about you? And this would never happen today in our polarized environment. He said, Strom's in the bag. I said, what do you mean? You guys are polar opposites. All he has to do is wait 2 months. He said, Stephen has breakfast with Emory Sneeden, his chief of staff, every morning. They work a lot of things out on a bipartisan basis. He loves Steve. So we appoint Steve, and a lame duck Congress with a lame duck president, unanimously supported by the Senate.
We need more of that today.
Now, there is one last piece. I have to end with this. I told you we lost the debate. We go down. Debates have a very short half-life. So the last weekend before the Tuesday election, Sunday, we're back even, and in the CBS poll, even pulling ahead. I'm in Chicago with Carter at the Hilton Hotel. We're campaigning in Illinois. We get a call from the Secret Service, be on the plane, Air Force One, in 45 minutes, we're going back to Washington. I said, why are we doing that? He said, well, there's a new offer from the Iranians. I begged Carter not to go back. I said, just look at the thing. You'll see that it's an improvement, but it's not enough. He went back, and it opened the whole Iran thing again. He said, well, it's a positive step, but it's not enough. And it just brought the house of cards down. And so then the last trip we made, the last weekend, it's called the Death March. You do it for every president. You go east to the setting sun in the west. We end up in a hangar in Boeing in Washington State. And as we're coming back on Air Force One, before the first vote is cast, Pat Caddell calls and says it's all over. That last trip you made just caused everything to collapse. Carter comes out of his cabin. I'm crying like a baby, having started with him, from nowhere. And I said, we let you down. And he said, no, you didn't let me down. It was very emotional. We landed. Rosalind was crying. No, the first vote hadn't been counted yet, but we knew it was over.
Well, this was just a teaser. You could see we could go on for hours. You can see why the book is as thick as it is, but as entertaining as it is. And this is hopefully gives you a sense of why you should pick up a copy on your way out. And of course, we know you want more, so at least on energy and environment, if you want 40 more minutes, our Columbia Energy Exchange podcast, where we toe deep on 3 Mile Island and the oil price shock of 1979, and Jim Schlesinger, the first energy secretary, the political fight over natural gas price deregulation, and much more. Stu?
I do want to tell you one anecdote, because we're in New York. I have to say this, okay. Because as I said, I have real interesting character portraits. To understand Jimmy Carter, you have to understand Miss Lillian, his mother, okay? In her 20s, as a registered nurse, she tends to black and white patients. Never done before. She gets paid in vegetables and chickens. At age 68, she goes into the Peace Corps in India. So she's a fierce defender of her son, of course, during the presidential election, where his signature line is, "I'll never lie to you." A reporter from New York, this is why I want to mention it, comes down to Plains and starts cross-examining Miss Lillian and says, "Now, you know, as his mother, he must have told lies. What is this, 'I'll never lie to you'?" And she said, "Honey, he told white lies all the time." "What do you mean by a white lie?" "Well, when I said how wonderful it was to have you down here from New York to Plains, that was a white lie."
Well, it's not a white lie to say it's a privilege to have you with us today. A privilege to work for you a long time ago, and to be here with my colleague Steve Sestanovich.
I'll just say on the book, I really appreciate Steve and Jason making this possible. Columbia has a lot of meaning to me for the fact that they're here and Dick Gardner was here. You can read the book by just reading the chapters thematically that you're interested in. You want the Middle East, there are 4 chapters on that. You want Iran, there are 2 chapters on that. So you don't have to go from start to finish, but if you do, and he's done it twice, and he's still alive, so.
Please join me in thanking Stuart Eizenstat.